Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mindful Metal Jacket. I am Joe List, and I am making my voice even more buttery and sing-songy than usual. Buttery. Isn't it weird that you can use the word buttery to describe a voice, and then we kind of know what people mean, but butter is really not like a voice. Like, butter doesn't make a sound. But yet you can be like, his voice is buttery. Sarah and I always say, what's her name? Chrissy, not Hind. What the hell's her name? McVie. Chrissy McVie. Is that her name? Fleetwood Mac. Is when the loving starts and the lights go down. That's a buttery voice. There's not another living soul around. You know what I mean? Buttery. This is a weird start. This is one of the weirdest starts to an episode, and also one of the most special episodes to me. Very special guest on the podcast today. In fact, I don't even know how I got her. It's crazy. Sharon Salzberg is on the podcast today. If you're not familiar, she is a meditation teacher and as described in her new book, a central figure in the field of meditation and a world-renowned teacher and author. Sharon Salzberg is one of the many Buddhist teachers that I've read and listened to for many years, and she's sort of a giant in the sort of American Buddhist teachers, along with Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein. I love Tara Brach, but I think she might have come a little later. I don't know my history that well, but she's been studying Buddhism since the 70s and teaching for many years. And she started the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, which is out in Western Mass. And I kind of took a swing. I just messaged her via Instagram, and somebody that works for her reached out or told me to email her, and I emailed and went back and forth and made it happen. It was exciting. I'm trying to get some I was going to say better guests. I think all the guests have been great. I'm trying to get some non-comedy guests, people that are in meditation and Buddhism and psychology and therapy, to kind of broaden a little bit. And so I reached out to a few, and Sharon was the one that got back, and we made it happen. So I have to thank her assistant that helped make it happen. And I was so thrilled and really nervous, as you'll probably hear. We kind of discuss it a little bit, but Sharon Salzberg is amazing. You can check out her podcast, The Metta Hour, on the Be Here Now network. I listen to it all the time. She's really great. She interviews other people in the field and all kinds of fields, and talks a lot of psychology, meditation, and she's great. She's just really calming and has a ton of wisdom. And she has a brand new book that they were kind enough to send to me. It's called Real Change: Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World. And they sent me a copy. I haven't read the entire thing, but I've read, I don't know, maybe 35% of it. I'm a slow reader. That is not a COVID cough. That is a acid reflux cough. I was at my parents' house yesterday and just went bananas. Smoked a cigar, ate an entire pizza from the Linwood, had a cheeseburger, chocolate chip cookies. So I'm feeling it today. Anyways, just finished talking to Sharon. I was a little anxious because, I'm not a journalist or an interviewer, really. And normally the podcast is talking to comedians, which is what I'm most comfortable doing in my life. So, but I think it went pretty well. I don't think I made a fool of myself. I don't think she hates me, but I'll probably think about that later. But my thoughts are not reality, and fear is just fear, as I often say, and as Sharon and I discuss. So feeling pretty good. I also want to take this time, because I'm looking at it, to plug my friend's book. I have a friend. That's right. I'm going to really name drop here. Sharon Salzberg is a guest. Maybe we're friendly now, but I have a dear friend. Maybe you've heard of him. Colin Quinn. Huh? How do you like that? Stick that in your pipe and smoke it. He's got a new book called Overstated, a coast-to-coast roast of the 50 states. And it is fantastic. I'm trying to read both these books at the same time. And I've only read a little bit of Colin's book as well. I am a dumb person, so it's hard for me to read 2 books at once. But that book is fantastic as well, and I highly recommend getting it. It's really funny and also really, I don't know, I was going to say smart, but that feels dumb to be like, the book is smart. He's smart. His writing is just brilliant guy, and very meaningful person. So check that out. And also, I got some dates this weekend, tomorrow and Saturday, Friday and Saturday, October 2nd and 3rd. I'm in Connecticut. You can go to craftbeercomedy.com. Check those out. Everything's half capacity, quarter capacity, so it might sell out. And then October 11th, Mark Norman and I are in Fairfield, Connecticut. That's the New York Comedy Club's show. And I'm going to have some other dates coming up soon, I think. And please continue to go check out I Hate Myself on YouTube. Leave a nice comment, thumbs up. And go subscribe and review this podcast, Mindful Metal Jacket, wherever you get your podcast. You can watch it on YouTube. It's always available now with video. And leave a nice comment on there and click the thumbs up. Get that algorithm going. And thank you again, as always, for all the very kind reviews on the podcast app or whatever it's called, iTunes podcast, whatever. I don't know how anything works, but all those reviews are really, really nice. So thank you. Subscribe. It helps. And thank you for all the kind emails and messages. Twitter, I'm trying not to check too often. So if you got something you really want to share, Instagram is where to do it. And anyways, thank you for listening. This is probably going too long, but just feeling good, very excited. I think you're going to get a lot out of this episode, a lot of wisdom, and maybe you'll learn some stuff about meditation. I highly recommend meditating, and I also recommend taking a break from your phone, aside from listening to podcasts. Anyways, let me give you some wisdom straight out of the book. This is from Sharon Salzberg's new book, Real Change, Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World. And there's a little meditation in the back that you can say quietly to yourself. I care about your pain, yet cannot control it. I will care for you and cannot keep you from suffering. May I offer love, knowing I can't control the course of life, suffering, or death. I wish you happiness and peace, yet cannot make your choices for you. That's a helpful thing to say and think and feel for a loved one, and even a non-loved one, which we discuss in this podcast. Thank you for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being you. Now enjoy this conversation with the great Sharon Salzberg. Awesome. Okay, we're recording. Hello. Thank you. Thank you for being here. This is very ironic, Sharon, because you're somebody that I read and listen to calm myself, and you have such a calming presence, and you've been so helpful to me. Yet now here I am talking to you, and I feel incredible anxiety and nervous. So
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's very ironic, but it's interesting. I mean, first of all, I've listened to your podcast and tons of talks and interviews you've done and read your book. And so it's, you're somebody that's been a part of my life, but I've never obviously met you or spoken to you. So it's strange. I'm also not a journalist. I'm a comedian. So I'm worried, I'm always worried. Normally I'm talking to comedians and we talk about meditation, therapy and anxiety and all these things. But that's my life, is talking to comedians. So I have to warn you, I'm not a journalist, but I do have thoughts and questions.
It's fantastic. You could probably cheer me up if you're
great. I'll try. Well, that's something I want to ask. So you're a meditator, a meditation teacher, and I know a lot about you. Maybe you could tell people, because these people may not be that familiar with you. This is mostly comedy fans. Could you tell a little bit about who you are and how you came into the business of meditation and all that good stuff?
Yes. Well, I started teaching meditation in 1974, or as my friends say, before it was cool. And I had gone to India as a college student in 1970. It was sort of like my junior year abroad. I went with an independent study program that I created um, because I wanted to learn how to meditate. And that formed in my mind that desire when I did an Asian philosophy course as a sophomore. And I was just blown away by it. I honestly, looking back, I think I chose it out of happenstance. It was like on Tuesday. I thought, oh, that's convenient. Let me do that, and it really changed everything for me. First, like many people, I'd had a very traumatic, uprooting, difficult childhood, and like for many people, mine was a family system where this was never ever spoken about, and so I didn't know what to do with all of those feelings inside of me. And then when we got to the Buddha, in that course, here's the Buddha saying right out loud, like, suffering is a part of life, which translated into my mind as, you're not so weird, you're not so different. You don't have to feel so cast out of life. So that was huge for me, actually. And then I heard in the context of that class that there were these methods, very practical, direct methods you could actually use to be happier, and they were called meditation. So I was going to school in Buffalo, New York, and I looked around Buffalo. I did not see it anywhere. This is 1970.
Sure.
And I created this project, and I said, I want to go to India to study meditation. So the university said yes, and off I went. And that was the beginning of everything.
Wow. And I remember hearing you doing an interview at one point talking about going to India, and whoever your teacher or instructor was, I forget what the instruction was, to kind of sit here and feel whatever you're feeling, or whatever it was specifically. And you thought, well, I could have stayed in Buffalo for that.
That's right. I did think that.
I didn't need to come here for that. What was the instruction? Do you remember?
Yeah, I definitely remember. I still do it. And meditation has lots of methods and lots of styles. Some sitting, some walking, some silent, some with voice. And often methods are progressive in that you start, with a foundational exercise and then you build on it. So the foundational exercise in lots of schools, lots of styles of meditation, is to sit down and feel your breath. Just feel the normal flow, the sensations of the in and out breath. It doesn't have to be the breath. You could use a mantra, you could use a sound, you could use an image, you could use anything else happening in your body. You could use loving kindness phrases, which I also teach a lot. But the reason the breath is chosen is, as my early teachers would say, first of all, you don't have to believe anything to feel your breath. You don't have to call yourself a Buddhist or a Hindu or reject anything else. If you're breathing, you can be meditating. And then, as one went on to say, I think really charmingly, he said the breath is very portable. So let's say you have a 10-minute a day formal meditation practice, and you sit and you use the breath as the place to rest your mind and come back to once you realize you've been distracted. Then you're, commuting, or you're at work, or you're on Zoom or something like that, and you're starting to get anxious, you're starting to get agitated. You don't need equipment. You don't need to sit down and close your eyes and look weird. You can use your breath to kind of steady yourself and ground yourself. So that was the first instruction: sit and feel your breath. And I thought, that is so stupid. Like I came all the way to India. Where's the magical, esoteric, fantastic piece of instruction that's going to wipe out all my suffering and make me a totally happy person? And as you said, I thought I could have stayed in Buffalo to feel my breath.
Right.
And then I thought, how hard can this be? Like, what'll it be? Like 800 breaths, 900 breaths before my mind wanders. And to my astonishment, it was like one breath and I would be gone.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing too, because a lot of people listening may be new to meditation or haven't even tried meditation. So obviously you've been meditating for a long, long time. How is it now for you? I mean, I imagine you still sit down to meditate for 10 minutes or an hour, whatever it is. I imagine your mind is still thinking thoughts, because that's the mind's job. It's a problem solving sort of computer, right? So it's not like you now, with all this experience, just sit down and it's complete emptiness the entire time. I imagine. I'm guessing.
No, that's true. And the goal isn't that kind of emptiness or blankness. A lot of people think it is. But really, we're just trying to have a different relationship to thoughts, not wipe them out.
Right.
Like we don't have to take every thought to heart and like nurse it, and strengthen it. Or even more intensely, we don't have to let it pick us up and, lead us out of the room and get in the car and go shopping or something, because we have like a random thought.
Right.
It's up to us how we want to follow the thought or not, if we can see it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the big problem. It feels like, is that people sort of identify with their thoughts and they don't even realize they're thinking. They think that this is my therapist always tells me, and I'd like to get into that too, of experience between therapy and meditation. I guess I'll just lead into that question, but my therapist always says your thoughts are just thoughts. You don't have to, your thoughts actually have no real bearing on reality. Your thoughts are not reality, and fear is just fear. That's what he always tells me. That's kind of become a mantra of mine, is fear is just fear. My thoughts are not reality. And so that's a question I had too. So I do therapy and I also meditate, and I find that they go great hand in hand. Do you find, is that your experience or what you recommend to people, or can you just meditate without therapy? By you, I mean people in general. Or do you recommend both for people that have been through trauma or have severe anxiety or panic, or what's your sort of thought process on that?
I think it really depends. I think they do often go hand in hand, and they can be great supports for one another. You know, people used to meditate, and this is, let's say, specifically in the case of somebody with severe trauma, or tremendous amount of anxiety. People used to meditate in a close personal relationship with a teacher.
Right.
And we have so many ideas about what good meditation looks like. Like, I'm going to wipe out all thoughts. I'm going to have total bliss for an hour. Anxiety is not going to arise. I'm not going to get sleepy. And most of them are really unfair to ourselves because they're not true.
Right.
And so meditation teachers will tell you that one of the core principles is balance. And balance always looks different for us, right? Some days we're like really distant from our experience, and balance would mean like come a little closer. And other days we're like totally enmeshed in our experience, and balance would be like, get a little space,
Right.
And so if you have a teacher who's personally guiding you, that's what they have in mind. And so, there's nothing sacrosanct about the ways we tend to meditate, like sit still, not every school says sit still.
Right.
Or close your eyes is another one. Not every school says close your eyes, or even what I suggested, or what I described as my first instruction, the first instruction given me, the breath doesn't work for everybody.
Right.
And so if you have someone you're working with that can really personalize, and, balance looks different at different times too. So, you might have a teacher who says to you, well, I think you should sit with your eyes up and don't sit for more than 5 minutes. That's a reasonable instruction. It doesn't mean you can't do the real thing. That is the real thing for you right then.
Right.
And in the absence of that, because for most people that doesn't exist, a lot of people are getting that kind of personal, intimate, direct experience working with a therapist at the same time they're meditating, because the same issues will arise. Boy, you're hard on yourself, or, that's an unfair standard, or whatever it is. And you can work at it that way, certainly, as well.
Yeah, I think for me, because I first got into, my whole story was crippling anxiety and panic. I've had a bunch of different times in my life where I had bouts with sort of chronic panic attacks where I was having them daily, and sometimes a couple times daily in my early 20s and then later on in my 20s. But I also was an alcoholic. I'm still an alcoholic in recovery now, but back then I was drinking excessively, thinking that I would be anxious. And then when I started drinking, I would become less anxious. And then of course, at some point in the night, I would get really anxious. And then the next day I would feel just horrendously anxious. And so I was always interested in meditation And this idea of being Zen, I was so anxious that to me, the opposite of that was desirable. This idea of being this Zen Buddhist guy, that everything was, I was impenetrable, which was my impression of meditation and Buddhism. And then I got sober and I went into the Eastern, philosophy or Eastern religion section of the bookstore. And the first book I found was Alan Watts' The Wisdom of Insecurity. And I read that, and that was confusing, but it's sort of like a Zen Buddhism. It felt like he was sort of talking about do you have a relationship with Alan Watts at all, either personally or just reading his stuff? And
I read his stuff when I was in college before I went to India. So that was really a long time ago,
Sure.
So I was like 16 or something like that. And it was very important for me.
Yeah. That it sort of opened that door. And I still love going back and reading his stuff. But at that time, a lot of those sort of more, and I'm not a Buddhism expert, but it feels like Zen Buddhism feels to me always more sort of confusing and going, where are we here? I'm a blade of grass. I don't know what the hell's happening here.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I found, what's the famous Zen book? Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And that I tried to read, and that just made no sense to me, but it still led me sort of closer to that path. I wanted to understand that. And is it normal for that book to be very confusing? I assume you're somewhat familiar with that book.
That book is deceptively simple, so its main message is actually in the title, and that's what's confusing, because like when I first saw it, I thought, oh, I know what that book must be about. Like, you start out with this awkward beginner's mind that you want to get rid of as soon as possible, and you work and you work and you work, and then you get a Zen mind. And then this is when I was home from India on a break. I saw the book. I didn't even buy it. I thought, I know what that's about. And then someone sent it to me in India, or I'd gone back, and I actually read it, and I thought, oh, it's the opposite. Look at that. Right. I got that totally wrong.
Right.
That the goal, in a way, is a beginner's mind, which we don't usually appreciate. Like the first time we do something and we're so open-minded and we laugh, if we fumble, or, because we know it's the first time I ever sat down at the piano. It's the first time I ever, did this thing. And we're so interested in everything, and we have that kind of more complete presence. So it was like, oh, wow, I got it totally wrong.
Right. That was a book that I read and got some out of and understood a little bit. And then the big one for me was discovering Thich Nhat Hanh, his books. I think Happiness was the first one I read, and then Peace of Mind. And now I have like a library of Thich Nhat Hanh books. And I know you reference him in your new book and his stuff. And my fans know that I reference him all the time. And he really sort of got me on this path as much as I am on that path. But his book seems so pragmatic and easily accessible and understandable. And he has a quality that I just see his name or a photo of him and start reading, I immediately feel calmer and more centered. And is that your experience with him? Have you meditated with him? Do you have a relationship with him?
I've met him, had met him a few times. He came here to Barrie, the Insight Meditation Society, for a visit once. And he taught here several times, but I wasn't here when he was teaching. And then I think the last time I saw him was on the stage at Town Hall in New York. And I'd had this totally frenzied time getting there, it was like a real New York story. I'd waited. In fact, this is in one of my other books, not the most recent one, but I'd waited too late to try to get a taxi. So it was that transition time where those of your listeners not in New York, there is a time when the taxis are winding down for that shift before the new shift begins. And so very few taxis, even if empty, want to take you because they have to go drop off their cab. And but they usually stop and ask where you're going. So if your destination is close to where they have to drop off the cab, they'll take you as the last ride. So that's what happened to me. And then this cab driver and I got stuck in this horrible, horrible, horrible traffic. And I thought, I'm never going to make it to Thich Nhat Hanh's lecture in time. And he's going to be late dropping off the cab. And I don't know what happens if you're late, if you get fined or what. And I kept saying, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I never imagined traffic would be this bad. And he said to me, "Madam, traffic is not your fault, nor is it mine." And I thought, wow, I didn't even have to go here, Thich Nhat Hanh. I just had an enlightened cab driver, but he got me there with like 0 seconds to spare. And I ran to my seat. And there was Thich Nhat Hanh walking with the utmost dignity to his seat, looking completely serene. It was very funny.
Yeah. I meditated at a thing in Boston, I think in Copley Square. I don't know, maybe it was 7 or 8 years ago now that he was leading this meditation, and there was a big crowd. And again, I was still new to meditation. I read his books, and I remember trying to sit on the ground, and I couldn't do it. That concept to me of I need to meditate in a chair still. The idea of sitting on the ground is just insanity to me. My legs hurt, my knees hurt, and evidently you're supposed to just feel that or accept that, but I do not accept knee and pain. My foot falls asleep, and I start to panic. So I looked at all these people, sitting down and meditating, and I kept leaning on an elbow, laying down, and I ended up having a headache by the end of it. So that was early in my journey, but that was my one experience actually being in his presence live. But anyway, so all that to get to my point that I started 10 minutes ago was I kept reading these books and trying to meditate on my own. And it took, for me, going to therapy really helped sort of get to the source of all of my anxiety and understand it. I think for me, one-on-one with the person, I love listening to these podcasts and these guided meditations, and now they're so valuable to me. But for me, it took sort of one-on-one with a person to kind of hear about my upbringing or whatever it was. And that really helped. And I now use those tools. So together, therapy and meditation have really allowed me to kind of get it more. So that's been my experience with that. So for everyone listening, I recommend both things, but it doesn't have to be that way, I guess.
I mean, it's exciting, I think, to think of our lives as, first of all, not so stuck, and as a kind of creative medium. And we can experiment with lots of different ingredients and see what works. I mean, another thing about anxiety is that, it's such a physical reality. And these days, people talk about breathing in certain ways so that your whole system can kind of calm down, and the vagus nerve and all that stuff. And, and it's like a lot of stuff to experiment with to see what's helpful.
Yeah. And this is something you sort of talk about in your book too. I think there's a meditation in there about sort of reminding ourselves that we're not really in control of the world, and we're in control of kind of very little, really. And in some ways, we're not even in control of our thoughts. It feels like just our response to our thoughts. Because for me, that was so much of my anxiety, and still is sort of wanting this guarantee that I'm going to be okay, that the world is going to be all right, and that the pandemic will go away and the election will turn out the way I want it to. And I've been always looking for this stamp of, all right, you're going to live for 85 years healthily, and then you'll pass away with your loved ones at your bedside. Don't worry about it. But that doesn't exist. And it took me about 37 years to realize that.
That's true. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. So it's sort of accepting that we're not in control. And it's interesting because that was the feeling for me of anxiety and panic attacks, is the feeling of being out of control. And ironically, that feeling is what it takes to sort of not have anxiety. Does that make sense?
Well, isn't that in a way, I mean, we're not in control of the arising of our thoughts. And I think that is a very forgiving reality, because usually we blame ourselves so mercilessly for what we're thinking, what we're feeling. It shouldn't be there. It should be over it. I've been in therapy, I've meditated all these years, and realizing that we can't control what arises in our minds, but we actually can relate very differently to what arises in our minds. And so we can be kinder to ourselves. We could remember it's not just me. This is kind of part of human conditioning, or many people have this tendency, give yourself a break.
Right.
Like if you blame yourself for an hour and a half, that is not going to leave you with a lot of energy to start over, and
right.
It's going to leave you exhausted. And so it's just not that skillful a reaction. And so we kind of say, well, I've been down that road before. Let me be kinder to myself. Things like that. We have lots of options. in
Right.
terms of how we relate.
Yeah, my therapist always gives me the advice, and I'm sure you've heard it and read it before, and I read it places, is that advice to be as kind to yourself as you would be to somebody else. Because I would never, if my wife tried meditating, I wouldn't go, yeah, but I bet you were thinking a bunch of thoughts, you dummy. I'm like, what's the point? You're still going to have anxiety. Like, it would be viciously mean, which we tend to be to ourselves, which I don't know what the science behind that is, but it's horrible. I feel that way all the time in my career and everything, all these things of, yeah, but you're still not making that amount of money. That one person hated your act or whatever it is. And so, and I talk about this a lot on this podcast, and I've read it a lot too. And maybe you could speak to it, or that the idea of meditation is sort of deepens the grooves of it works that muscle to kind of go back into that, quieting the mind and sort of recognizing that thoughts are just thoughts. Because if you're not doing that, that's just your habit, is to go back into maybe self-hatred or believing whatever thoughts you have, and sort of, so it's trying to kind of undo that. Is that one of the things of mindfulness?
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's sort of knowing the difference between what's actually arising, thought, feeling, sensation, whatever it is, and what we're adding to it. Like a very common thing would be you feel physical pain or discomfort, or you feel emotional pain, you feel heartache, you feel disappointment. And right away you start thinking, what's it going to feel like tonight? What's it going to feel like tomorrow? What's it going to feel like next week? So not only are you having to deal with what's actually happening, which is that something hurts, but you've now added all that anticipation on top of it, and it feels overwhelming, because it is overwhelming,
Right.
And so that's a habit. It's just a habit to add the future, right, when something doesn't feel good. Or, what we were kind of talking about before, I shouldn't feel this. I've been in therapy all this time. Why am I still angry? Why is this still coming up? Or I've been meditating for 50 years, for God's sake, why is this still coming up? And, it's just like, if you think about the energy that we expend in judging ourselves, which only leaves us exhausted, and demoralized. It doesn't leave us with like, I'm going to learn not to do that again, Like,
right.
It's not like a tool of resilience by any means. And so, that's what we learn to undo, not the original thoughts, feelings, sensations, because that's just life, things arise because we are very conditioned in certain ways. And so, but we can be totally different with what arises.
Right.
And that's like, it's very possible. It's not unreal or imaginary, and it's freedom.
Right.
Like also listening to, I think about my friend, one of my colleagues, Sylvia Borstein, who, she's 81 or 82 now, and she describes herself as a recovering catastrophizer. And that's what drove her to learn how to meditate, is because she was suffering so much from, as she put it, she'll describe herself this way, like, I'll call one of my adult children, and they're all like in their 50s and 60s now. I'll call one of my children and they don't answer the phone. So my first thought is, well, they must be dead.
Right.
So it never occurs to me they're taking a shower.
Right.
Or they just fell in love. They don't feel like talking to their mother.
Right.
And, and that's what got her to meditate, was I have to deal with my mind somehow, because of course, and it's not only our own anxiety, it affects relationships when you're like on your kids that way, for example. And she might have those thoughts, not with the same prevalence, maybe not with the same intensity, but they come, and now she laughs at it, because she also knows, as she describes herself, in a real situation where something's gone wrong, she's like a rock. She's steady, she's present, she's helpful. She's not intrusive. It's just when she's left alone with her mind,
Right.
spinning out, that she goes there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that makes me feel good to hear, because I have a very similar thing, a similar experience. And I've talked about this on the show before, is that in my mind, I'm this really weak, terrified person, and I'm not going to be able to handle anything. If anything goes wrong, it's all going to come apart. But in reality, I think there's actually some psychological studies that really anxious, neurotic people are actually the best in crisis situations. But I always use as an example, I'll go to, if I have blood taken or any kind of needle, or get anesthetized at the dentist, or whatever it is, I'll go, I really don't like needles. I get really freaked out. And they'll say, well, what do you mean? Like, what happens? And I'm like, I just get really nervous. And then they're like, well, do you pass out? Do you run out of the chair? And I was like, oh, no, nothing like that. And they're like, oh, that, to them, that's bad. Some people take blood and they pass out, or they run away, or they punch the doctor in the face. I'm like, oh no, I'm just uncomfortable.
That would be bad.
Yeah, exactly. So I had a tooth extraction, and the dentist, there was stitches in there, and he was taking the stitches out, and I was like, I'm sweating. I don't know if I can do this. And then when he was doing it, I was completely still. And he's like, you just handled that better than 95% of patients. It's just my anxiety, and he's not even noticing it really. So I feel similarly, and I've always been a hypochondriac too. So same thing. If I have knee pain, I'm going to need knee surgery. If I have a headache, I got, a brain tumor, whatever it is. But yeah, now through meditation and therapy as well, it allows myself to kind of go, it's probably not that. And it's much more short-lived. It's still there. I still have those thoughts, but it's much more short-lived, which feels like progress.
It's huge progress, and it's real progress, because I think we would all like the great breakthrough experience after which none of the stuff ever came up again. But I think that's not what happens. I think that it still arises. We relate very differently to it. It doesn't last as long. We don't take it in as deeply. This sort of like, I call it the Swiss cheese theory of transformation. It's like we poke holes in it even as it's there.
Right.
So it's not like solid and inflexible. It's like, oh yeah, maybe not,
Right. I've heard the analogy about, zebras, looking for zebras or something in the medical field, where if you're in New York City, I live in New York, and I think you did as well, or do. And if you hear like a clip clop in the street, most likely it's a horse. There's horses in New York, but like hypochondria anxiety is like, that's probably a zebra. I bet that's a zebra. And you're like, well, there could be a zebra walking up 7th Avenue, but most likely it's a horse. And so I feel that way I always use that analogy of when I'm feeling sick or whatever it is, and I think, oh, I must be dying. I'm sort of going, that's probably a horse, if that makes sense. And it does, help me. Yeah. But that's how I've always been, is this alarmist. And I talked about a year ago, or maybe it was 2 years ago now, I had a sore throat, and I went to an ENT, and he diagnosed me with silent reflux, or LPR, whatever you call it. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have no voice. I'm going to have esophageal cancer. And now I've realized a year later, after a year of that, I realized, oh, my throat's sore for a few hours after I eat pizza. it's fine. But anyway, so I owe all of this to the combination of meditation and therapy is what I'm getting at here. But I wonder if you could talk about what your meditation practice looks like now after all these years. Is it something, do you wake up? Are you doing guided meditation? Is it on your own still, or do you do an hour? Are you meditating all day? What's a meditation practice look like for someone that's been doing this and teaching for so long?
Well, we usually divide meditation into two aspects. One is like a formal dedicated period. It might be sitting, it might be walking, it might be lying down, but say 10, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, so whatever the length of time is. Your goal in that time, or your intention in that time, is to deepen awareness and qualities like compassion. You're not also trying to figure out a career change or something like that. Like that may come up, but that's not why you sit down to do it, to figure it out. So, and so that's like the dedicated period. And the other part of meditation is what we sometimes call short moments many times. And that's just like remembering. Like Thich Nhat Hanh actually had the most famous recommendation, which is don't pick up your phone on the first ring. Let it ring 3 times and breathe, and then you pick it up.
Right.
It's just these little bitty times throughout the day. Maybe don't always multitask when you're drinking a cup of coffee.
Right.
Maybe just smell the coffee, taste the coffee, feel the warmth of the cup, things like that. Nothing that is going to like completely upend your to-do list or is going to take you 18 hours to do, but just short moments many times. And most of what that depends on is reminders. like that's why the phone ringing is a good one, because it's a signal.
Right.
Or people tell me they do things like, maybe after you've written the email, don't press send right away. Take a few breaths and then read it again, maybe, and then press send.
Right.
If you want to. So I believe very strongly in that first, the dedicated period of meditation, because I think it makes the second much easier. Otherwise, it starts to get pretty hypothetical, like, yeah, tomorrow I'll start, or, like, oh, there was the phone I forgot,
Right.
But if you have that little period of, it's almost like strength training each day, then you can much more easily remember, I'm just going to drink this cup of coffee right now, and I'll check my email later, and something like that.
Yeah.
So my own practice is I meditate every day. The last neuroscientist I talked to about how long a daily practice should look like in order to actually produce measurable changes in your brain, she said to me 12 minutes.
Interesting.
Then in her lab, they found 12 minutes a day. Now, nobody knows exactly. The neuroscientists I talked to before then, which was a couple of years ago, and they're both friends of mine. They're both like really good scientists. He said 7 to 9 minutes a day. So nobody knows exactly, but it's always stunning to me that nobody's saying you have to do this formally 8 hours a day to get any result. It's like that's the period of strength training each day, and then we just bring it into our life as best we can. So I do sit every day. I also, in terms of 7 to 9 or 12 minutes, I usually say, I don't know if it's that useful to go for the bare minimum, like maybe we could extend it a little bit. Right. So I try to sit at least 20 minutes a day, and probably usually these days more than once a day. And there are also so many techniques. Like, I started talking about the foundational exercise of, like, say, being with the breath. And then when you find your attention wandering, you come back. And then on top of that, we build mindfulness of emotions and sensations, things that become predominant, really strong, so that we might spend a little time just looking at them and observing them, and then coming back to the breath. And so I do some of that for sure. And then there's another whole stream of meditation called loving kindness meditation, which I do a lot of, where you don't rest your attention on the feeling of the breath. You silently repeat certain phrases like, may I be happy, may I be peaceful, may you be happy, may you be peaceful. So it's just like a different style, and I do quite a lot of that, especially these days.
Yeah, it feels so important these days to try to do that stuff and to have as much, to practice as much compassion as possible. And I've been doing some of those guided metta loving kindness meditations. And I actually had a question about that, because I've listened to some guided meditations of loving kindness, and the advice of the person leading the meditation is to find someone that you have uncomplicated feelings about, and you can think about someone like that, not someone that's maybe whatever it is, a parent, but someone that you sort of pretty well, but you're not like, boy, he drives me crazy with this, and just sort of think like that. Do you ever do a loving kindness meditation for somebody that you really disagree with, say a politician, for example? We won't name any specific ones, but my audience knows who I'm talking about. Can you meditate on somebody that just seems like a horrible human being? Is that a helpful thing? Is that something you've tried before?
Yeah, I mean, in the classical systematic practice of loving kindness, we make this offering of loving kindness to a variety of people, and it's important to understand what loving kindness means. It doesn't mean you like somebody. It doesn't mean you approve of them. It doesn't mean you're going to give in to their views or whatever. It means that you have a very deep sense within, which may not be emotional even, but you have a deep sense that our lives are intertwined, and that everybody actually really does want to be happy in a profound sense, not in a stupid sense. We want to feel a sense of belonging. We want to feel a sense of home somewhere in this body, in this mind, with one another on this planet. And it's because of the force of ignorance that we make so many mistakes. If you think about everything we're taught, what makes us strong, what makes us happy, and the myths and even the lies that we're given and how readily we believe them. And then, vengeance will make us strong and safe. Well, really? Let's take a look. And compassion is stupid and it'll make you weak. Well, really? Let's take a look. And that's sort of one of the gifts of mindfulness, is that we can see for ourselves. But, so we offer loving kindness to all kinds of beings as long as we understand what it is. And the classical rotation can't all be done in 10 minutes. It's like over time. We start with ourselves. We offer love and kindness to ourselves. And then someone known as a benefactor, somebody that we feel grateful for, that the texts say this is the one who, when we think of them, we smile. It could be an adult, could be a child, could be a pet. Like lately I've been using a puppy as a benefactor because my friends, his family adopted a puppy and they're so much happier than they were before. So I think of that puppy,
Sure.
And it makes me smile. So it's oneself, the benefactor, a friend, someone called a neutral person, which is a very interesting category. It's somebody we usually don't like very much. We feel kind of indifferent to them. And very often this is someone who plays some kind of role in our lives so that we see them now and then, but we objectify them. We look right through them, basically. And probably for 45 years, my colleagues and I have been saying, like the checkout person in the supermarket, that would be a perfect example of a neutral person. So I was doing a meditation, which was being recorded the other day. And I heard myself say that. And I went, whoops, look at that. Now we call them essential workers. And you really think, how do we think we get to eat,
Right.
But there are a whole lot of people we look right through. And so that's the neutral person. And then a difficult person, somebody we actually don't like, or we don't like their behavior, or they're very difficult for us. But by then, we hopefully have a sense of what it feels like, say, to have compassion for someone like that and for ourselves.
Right.
Or a sense of compassion for them and a really strong understanding. I'm not giving in, I'm going to fight because I think their actions are harmful, but not with hatred. We're not coming from a place of hatred. And then after the difficult person, we come to all beings everywhere. Right. So in any one sitting, like if you're doing it at home, you only got 10 minutes. Usually we say, start with yourself. If you can, start with yourself, end with all beings. And maybe there's one person in the middle because you don't have time, for so many people. So that middle part is usually very situational. Like I have a friend having surgery. I'm going to offer loving kindness to them. Or I have a friend getting an award today. I'm going to offer loving kindness to them. Or I'm going to the supermarket.
Right.
I'm going to choose the clerk, something like that.
Right. Yeah, I've done some of those, and you really do feel good afterwards. I feel really, lighter, and you really do feel good and positive, and it does sort of affect my behavior in the immediately following. Not that I'm walking around, being an asshole to people, but you tend to feel yourself being nicer and kinder and really noticing people more. And so it's a practice I highly recommend. And you do talk about it in your new book. I want to also mention your new book, and I'll mention in the beginning and the end, Real Change, Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World. And that's available now. And I thank you for sending me a copy. And I'm a slow reader, so I've read as much as I could in the few days that I've had it. And I think you talk about what we just talked about there in the book. And it was fantastic. I'm enjoying it very much. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned phones and letting the phone ring. How are you, and I assume you still have, students at the Insight Center and stuff. How do you see the phone addiction and social media, all this stuff? I get despair thinking about it, seeing it, watching people walk around with their heads buried in the phone, literally crossing the street. And it feels like the antithesis of mindfulness. I mean, it is. It's not even really up for debate, I guess, unless there's people who are really mindful in the conversation they're having while crossing the traffic. But it really does seem like mindfulness in this country is becoming more prevalent than it's ever been, thanks to people like yourself. But it seems like it's running up against this. The ultimate enemy of mindfulness is the cell phones, smartphones. What's your interpretation? Do you have hope for this? Do you feel despair? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't feel despair. I have a lot of hope, but it's challenging. I was teaching a class once, and this professor friend of mine was in the class, and he said he was very worried about his students and their use of social media. And as he put it, he said, no one posts a photo of their mediocre lunch. Right. So it's all a curated life and presentation and trying to look perfect and feeling you're not perfect enough. Your lunch didn't have foam or whatever, and so it's used in a lot of ways, and that can be destructive, but it has so much potential. And I just keep thinking about that potential. It's like, our center is closed right now, and any courses that are happening online. And I think we all miss the days when you could truck up to Barry, and like be together and silently. And yet, people write me all the time and they say, well, I got older. I'm taking care of, my really elderly mother. I can't go to retreats anymore. I'm so appreciative of what you're doing online. Or if I am teaching a course online, I see people are signing in from Dubai, and right. all over Europe and Russia. And I think really, so that potential to help us connect, and social media is included in that, like I went to India, like I said, at the age of 18. I grew up in New York. I went to college in Buffalo. I'd never even been to California before. And I went to India because that desire to learn was so strong. And after I'd been in India, I felt like that was another kind of home for me. And I realized that I didn't have any psychological distance from India anymore. Like I could go there for a week.
Right.
And I realized that the potential of something like social media is that people will not have psychological distance from anyone. And that's great. But you're right. Of course, there's so many people in New York tell me, not now because everything's so weird, but before, I miss the old New York because you could have these conversations with all these different kinds of people. Now no one's talking to one another. They're all just looking at their phones.
Right.
And so, I think it's like any instrument. It could be used well or it could be used badly. And I would hope that we would learn to use it well.
Yeah, that's my hope as well, is that people will start to see the negative aspect of being on your phone so much. And but yeah, I mean, there are now mindfulness apps, and there's a lot of my guided meditations are through smartphone apps, and all these podcasts, of course. So there are hours of instruction and guided meditations through smartphones, of course. But I've had it happen to myself where I do a guided meditation and I feel great, and then I open my phone to whatever, and then 30 minutes have just disappeared, and then I feel like I'm like, and this again is, I shouldn't beat myself up, I guess, but I'm like, God, I just wasted this 30 minutes right after doing this great meditation. And I'm like, I feel like I got to meditate all over again. But I guess what the positive is that I'm mindful of the fact that, man, I just was kind of mindlessly on my phone for 30 minutes. But it does scare me I just listened to a podcast about this, and they made this documentary, The Social Dilemma, about, all this dangers of the phones, and that there's supercomputers on the other side reading our thoughts and minds, and it starts to get tripped out. And it's easy for me to go into, and this is a lot of your book is about, it's easy for me to go into really dark places, thinking about the future of humanity, whether it be, politics or smartphones, or having society not being able to agree on what's actually happening. But it sounds like you're relatively hopeful for the future. Is that right? Or
I am relatively hopeful for the future. I can go the other way,
sure.
sometimes but I am relatively hopeful for the future because even now, where there's so much awful stuff happening, if you're paying attention, you can also find the other side. Back to New York because even though I'm not there, I still have a rented apartment there, and which I decided to rent for this year because I'd like to get back there sometime, and there's no knowing. And people tell me all the time, lived in my apartment for 12 years. I never even knew the names of my neighbors, and now everyone has everyone's names and phone numbers, so we can check in on one another.
Right.
Or a friend of mine who just turned 86, he said to me, I got the phone numbers of all the elderly people in my building. I noticed he didn't say the other elderly people. I don't think he thinks of himself that way.
Sure.
Of the elderly people in my building, and I check in on them. Or food distribution or something like that, and it's there. It's hard to even look at sometimes because it feels not commensurate with the really awful stuff happening, but that's there, and it's pretty important to keep including that.
Yeah, and I try to remind myself also that negative stuff really sells. The scary stories, the bad stories, and that's where sort of capitalism takes over. Is that's the money is in, hey, look at this riot, or hear what this person said, that's crazy, and it's not quite as appealing for whatever reason to be like, hey, look at this person that did all this volunteer work and we have the solutions to this thing. So it is important to stay positive, or at least see things with reality, I guess I would say. And the reality is that there's a lot of good and positive happening. And you talk about a little bit in the book too about, and something that I've dealt with a lot being on social media and a public figure, of trying to do something positive and then reading comments or getting feedback that some people are like, this is great, thank you. And some people are like, this is terrible, or this is not right, or whatever. So that's something you've dealt with before, and how do you deal with that? I know you talk about it a little bit in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who's a so-called public figure, who's a creative person, who produces things, deals with it. This is my 11th book.
Wow.
And, people, I would like to think everybody loves my books without exception, but it's not always the case by any means, People have their own stuff, their own interpretations, their own feelings, and you kind of learn. And the example you're talking about is somebody asked me, actually, I was at an airport somewhere. Somebody asked me if I would lead a minute of loving kindness meditation for the kids who were in cages at the border. So loving kindness in Pali, the Pali language, which is like the colloquial form of Sanskrit. It's the language of the original Buddhist text, is metta, M-E-T-T-A. So it's 2 T's. And so they said, would you lead a minute of metta for the kids in cages? So I wrote back and I said, yeah, let me think about it. I'm only going to be home for like a day, and then a couple of days, and then I can write a script, and maybe I can record something, and then we could put something up. And then, so I did that. And then the day came, just a couple of days later for the actual minute. And I was in another airport. I just sat silently and did my minute. And then I started getting comments like on Twitter. You're as bad as the people who only send thoughts and prayers. Why don't you do something? And you should be demonstrating, or you should be donating money, or you should, and I would just write back and say, these things are very hard to look at, to take in, even to bear witness to this degree of pain. And I said, this is what helps me keep looking and not deflecting and not pretending. And I said, and besides, I did already donate money, do things. And I said, I can't keep connected to this without also connecting to something bigger.
Right.
And I would affirm that right now, it's not an excuse not to take action, but it's what helps us have a bigger sense of life, and some perspective, and not just go down with every challenge, because it doesn't help anybody in the end. If we're just like super tormented ourselves and overcome, really, we're not going to want to get out of bed. I mean, why would you?
Right. Yeah. So that sort of speaks to the interconnectedness that we talk about and think about a lot, is that you sort of take care of yourself so you can take care of loved ones, and that sort of spreads out, right? I mean, we can only control what we can control. And so that starts with, I think, sort of taking a positive attitude towards some things, and doing whatever it is we can do, whatever we can contribute. I try to think about that with, the environmental crisis. I'm like, well, I can be mindful of what I'm doing and try to harm the environment the least amount I can. And I donate money to the Nature Conservancy, and then, talk about it when I can, and then try not to feel too much despair because I can't just solve a climate crisis. That's beyond what I'm able to do. So I just try to be part of the solution. I mean, is that what you'd advise for things like that? I mean,
yeah, sounds very wise, because we can only, it's like if you find the issue or the work that you're most passionate about and you do it, you can have a respectful relationship to everything else, but you don't have to like let it enter you, and just like weaken you. Because it's a very hard lesson to learn. It's like when I said we start loving kindness practice in the classical sense with offering loving kindness to ourselves. That's not so easy for people.
Right.
And the underlying principle of the practice, the reason that there's that arc, is that we're supposed to do it in the easiest way possible. So the theory is that we're the easiest person of all. Right. And we should start with ourselves. And I've taught, obviously, innumerable people for whom that is not true. And so I say, well, let's go back to the principle. Start somewhere else.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's a good reminder that we can control our own actions, and that's sort of the most important. Or it's a good starting off place, and we can't really control anyone else's actions, just our how we handle them or interpret our response to them. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I want to plug the book again: Real Change: Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World. And I really appreciate it. I'm really enjoying the book, and also your podcast. You're still doing the podcast, right? Mm-hmm. The Meta Hour, is that it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The Meta Hour, which is on Be Here Now Network, which has a bunch of great stuff that I love. I think Joseph Goldstein, is he on there?
Yeah, he's on there. Joseph, I tend to like interview people on my podcast. With Joseph, they tend to take his teaching and his talks and encapsulate it, which is great.
Yeah, they're both great. And so I highly recommend those. And Sharon, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I was thrilled to have you on, and I'm grateful. And I hope it was as enjoyable for you as it was for me.
It was really enjoyable. Thank you.
Good. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Mindful Metal Jacket is hosted by comedian Joe List. Produced by Joe List. Edited by Matt Kleinschmidt. Executive producers Robert Kelly and Matt Kleinschmidt for the Laugh Button Podcasts.